War. That is the beginner's guide we're going over today, and you might note this is a war game. So this is going to be rather encompassing, and that is why I did not cover it in my beginner's guide, which is in the playlist below if you haven't seen it yet. Covers the basics of getting into this game, but we're going to tackle a much broader, bigger topic today, and I won't be able to go fully in depth on every topic, but we're going to at least try to cover everything and then make more advanced guides later as we go in. So I booted up a game here, 1939, September 1st, as the Axis. That way I can have the first turn. And we're going to go over the basics of everything. To start are the units. You see I have some nice little visuals here of all the units, looking kind of like a board game. If you don't like this board game video game graphics aesthetic, you can change it. These are the defaults. You can get rid of those little board style counters underneath, or you can even add them to naval units in different forms, or turn them off entirely, these 3D units, so that you're instead staring at NATO counters. Now, I don't know what any of this stuff means, so we're going to be doing this with this on. If you already know what the NATO counters mean, you don't need me to explain them to you. However, these symbols, these visuals could probably need some explaining, as of course these are not standard in other video games. What we're looking at here are some land infantry units. We have a wide variety of land units, and of course we have some planes, and the ships are all also pretty self-explanatory as well. Starting with the smallest version of a land unit, this is a garrison. These are used for, well, garrisoning. You don't really want them fighting on the front lines. When you have 4 little men on one board piece, you have an army. These are generally the strongest infantry units that there are, if you do not count mechanized, for example. And these are corps, which are something in between a garrison and an army. They're faster than both, and yet not stronger than armies, but they are cheaper than armies and way more efficient, and you'll generally have access to more of them. This is of course a tank. There are multiple different kinds of tanks. There's tanks, there's heavy tanks, there's light tanks, and we'll go over those a little bit as we see them. The unit models themselves do change over time as you upgrade them, so they won't always look like you're seeing here. Like, these tanks will change very dramatically as time goes on, and even these planes will. These fighters right here, if I were to right-click upgrade them to advanced fighters, well, these ones barely change visually this early on. They get a different little color on the nose there. Other ones have far more dramatic changes. You can see here, medium bombers with ground attack weapons start looking much different. If you want to get information about a unit one step at a time, all you need to do is right click on it, go to properties, and then find that unit. You can also get information on different types of terrain here, which we'll get to in a moment. But if you right click, say, this corps, you can find all the statistics that go into deciding what this unit does. There are the base statistics, which you are looking at right now, and then there are upgraded statistics, which take effect when certain technologies finish passively, but they do not get shown here. And then also when you manually upgrade something, then it will show here as well. So for example, it doesn't appear we have any upgraded units here at the start, yet if I go over to this plane here, this fighter, I'm going to upgrade it with advanced fighters, and you'll see it modifies some of the stats, and the way it shows all the cumulative modifications tech has added to this unit. The way it shows this is by adding a little bracket here showing the new relevant number. So all the base stats will stay here, and then the end result of all cumulative passive and active technologies you have applied will show here. One example of a passive tech that you can see here is, you notice how none of the techs are being applied now. Well, we still have 2 interceptions and escorts. That is because certain passive research, such as especially these right here, the ones that have warfare next to them, will apply some sort of passive benefit to different units. Infantry warfare is one of those ones that doesn't apply broadly, because it just changes the morale of everything. You'll notice that if you look at the morale, you'll be like, oh, it's generally 10% higher, but nothing will specifically tell you, hey, this tech is why this is happening. Aerial warfare, however, is an example of one that can give 2 strikes on a unit instead of 1. Armored warfare does the same. as an example for tanks. We won't touch too deeply on research during this, but in terms of military, this is where all of your upgrades are going to come from. Generally, everything on the left here is an active upgrade that you must pay to apply. Everything on the right here is a passive upgrade that will automatically apply once it activates. And most specifically, down here at the bottom right is a collection of texts that are generally the only non-military specific tech, sort of spying and intelligence, logistics, production, and industrial technology. They can have some bearing on military, such as production technology, lowering unit costs just across the board, logistics, making it easier to operate those units via train, and we'll get to how all that works in a little bit. I'll make a further guide on research later, but that is generally what you need to know of it for right now. Left hand active text, right hand passive text, they all have pretty self-explanatory tooltips at the bottom there that will tell you what they do in case you are curious. And to recap, right click units to upgrade. You can only upgrade if you're not next to an enemy unit and if you have enough supply, which is another thing we'll be talking about in this video. With those basics covered, the next thing to cover is what units do I have access to as a player? So generally, you are going to have to make a lot of your troops, depends where you put your points. This is a game about managing money, MPPs, which come from different industries like mines. You can see how much money is generated by hovering over something, for example, or clicking it. And at the bottom right, you'll see information about it. The amount of MPPs generated here shows you how much you get. There's also convoy routes and things and events that can provide money as well, but you need to take these and turn them into, for example, upgrades. If I go to upgrade, try to put advanced fighters, you see that's 25 MPPs. I only have 50. If I want to instead reinforce a core up to the base max strength of any unit in the entire game, with the very small exceptions of, say, garrisons, is going to be 10. That's 14 MPPs. If I was bringing an army up to 10 instead of a core, then that would be even more money. Garrisons can only go up to 5. They are a rare unit that acts differently to others because they're not supposed to be frontline fighters. Once you do reinforce or upgrade a unit, which as a reminder needs to not be bordering an enemy with the exception of normal reinforcements, then you will spend your MPPs immediately and you will end the turn of those units. There are very few times you could do multiple actions in a turn, but we'll cover the examples of what you can in this video. There's another way to get past 10 strength, or even 5 on different units. If we look at this unit, I'm going to click it, but I want to take your attention down here to these little roundels here, I suppose. As these roundels fill up, that indicates your unit getting experience. You earn experience by engaging in combat where you don't die. Getting kills is especially useful for earning experience. As your experience goes up, your stats will as well. This doesn't really reflect in the actual properties, stats values. However, you will notice it in the rolls when you try to attack. As you fill up these little roundels, you are earning experience levels, which will then enable you to use elite reinforcements, which on top of your 10 strength, once you've reached there, you will actually be able to spill it over to 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and the price for this is exorbitant compared to normal reinforcement prices. However, it does not consume any experience, and the benefits you get to it in combat really outweigh any benefits of having a higher number. For example, if I have a 9 strength unit fighting an 8 strength unit of similar caliber, the difference is notably less than if I have a 11 strength fighting a 10 strength. However, it is more expensive. And remember what I just said about consuming experience? That's because if you reinforce normally, then what you're actually going to do is lower your overall experience. That's why this experience loss is here. You'll lower your experience because normal reinforcement is taking green fresh recruits and bringing them into a unit, thus bringing the average experience level of the unit down. Whereas elite reinforcements is taking battle-hardened units, or training battle-hardened units essentially, and you're using them to otherwise buff up the capabilities of an already rather experienced group. Now, as for how basic combat works, as you can see here, every unit takes up an entire hex all by itself. Air cannot stack over land, but it does have its own range. If you do wish to see the ranges of a unit, it is located in the general stat. You can see spotting ranges on either land or naval hexes, and naval spotting can spot anything given a turn to spot, including hidden enemy submarines, by the way. You can see the action points. This is your ability to move and then even attack afterwards. And you can see things like your strike range for doing an attack, intercept and escort if you are a fighter. But if I wanted to say attack this cavalry unit or this cavalry unit, I could select a unit within one hex. Most of the time when it comes to land units, artillery can attack over a hex. They get a little bit of extra range. Air has, as we just saw, a much further range, but I could select, say, this tank, and now there are some numbers showing, including some roundels if I hover over. So you'll see the German roundel says 0 and the Polish roundel says 4. This is predicting, but it's not set in stone, that this German tank will suffer 0 casualties and the Polish will suffer 4 casualties. Given that these are 4 strength cavalry units, it's basically suggesting we would kill them all. However, if I went up against this enemy army that's out here in the field with 5 strength, it's saying we would lose 1 strength and they would lose 3 strength. This is only a prediction, and this could vary by even up to 2 numbers. They could lose only 1, and I could lose 3 on a really, really bad roll. It really does a dice roll in the background every time you do one of these. All other relevant information for an attack can generally be found either on the map in front of you or on this bottom panel. So for example, we are in a field. You can see when we hover over our unit there at the bottom right, we are in a field. It changes when I try to go down there, but these are the tanks. They have 2 strikes thanks to that tech that I mentioned earlier. They have readiness and morale. These are sort of the same stat, honestly, just twice. These are indications of, well, how long have you been in a well-supplied area, and do you have tech to support you, and are you connected to a headquarters unit, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. How many action points you have, your entrenchment level. If you're playing defensively, if someone attacks you, you'll get a defensive bonus based on the total amount of entrenchment you have. In a field, you cannot entrench very high, only up to 2, but in some places, you can entrench much higher, even to like 6 and beyond. And then your supply is important to determining how well your attacks and defenses go, but its main importance is in affecting your readiness, your morale, and your ability to reinforce, because if you don't have at least 6 supply, then you can never reinforce up to full strength, nor can you get elite reinforcements. Once you hit 5 strength, it goes down to 8 that you can reinforce up to, and it keeps shrinking the lower the supply goes. But just to show you an example of what combat looks like, we're going to take this tank and we're going to attack this Polish cavalry. We dealt the 4 damage promised and took none as the game suggested. This actually completely destroyed the enemy cavalry unit. So it's no longer there. He cannot reinforce it. He can rebuild it, and he can do this for a cheaper price than building a brand new cavalry unit would go. Rebuilding units is always cheaper, but not everything can be rebuilt. For example, if a ship sinks, it cannot be rebuilt. But if a corps dies, then theoretically you have some of the equipment of them still lying around, and you could take that equipment and form a new one for a cheaper price. And that's kind of the idea there. Now, to show you a less advantaged attack opportunity here, if I were to, let's take this army here, which only has 1 strike, not 2. And I attacked this unit. You see the odds, they're still good, I guess, but they're not nearly as great, right? It says we will lose 1 and we will deal 2. Let's see what that looks like. So we actually only dealt 1. The roll did not give us the best prediction we could have gotten. However, they didn't deal any damage either. And in fact, they were so injured because they started out at half strength anyway. They chose to retreat. Retreating is up to the system, basically. It's simulating the commander saying, hey, holding this position is a bad idea. We need to retreat. We need to get the fuck away from here so we don't open ourselves up to further attacks on this position. Attacking here wasn't necessarily the greatest. Even if he was in a field And he may not have been entrenched, as we see none of these other guys are entrenched. This was on the other side of a river, and it's hard to get information on rivers. Like right here we can see it, there's a river on this hex. It's always on a hex, but you have to look visually to see it. If you attack over a river, then bad things can follow from that. There is sort of a way to see it. If you click on this army, hover it over here, I can't really move the mouse there, but at the bottom you'll see a little tank on an arrow pointing to the right where there's a number 1 and a number 2, and there's something that looks like a wind effect, 3 squiggly little lines. That wind effect actually means water, and it's saying that you will be attacking over a river and showing you a negative modifier to the odds of your attack power. And that's at the bottom is where you can kind of see terrain and other things playing their part. I could also say right click here and go to the river, which is actually just the hex, just like a field, and see what it changes. Separate to the fact that it will impact attacks, it also lets him entrench 2 times, just like a field. If I find something that's not a field, like say the mine that this cavalry is on top of, I could see even more stuff. For one, I could see this mine is actually capable of spotting things 1 hex out, which is interesting to note. But more importantly, I could see if being used defensively, if I have a unit on top of this mine, I can see that I gain +1 defensive values to all these different kinds of attacks. Soft attacks, hard attacks, these are generally your infantry attacks, as well as a ton of different air attacks. And this one will let me actually entrench to 3 and not 2. So that's a little bit better than being on a field or potentially on a standard river hex. If you're curious what kind of unit you're dealing with, for example, if we take our tanks, we could see that we deal, these are our attack values, this much damage to these kinds of units here. This much can be defended against effectively. So you can see we're not very good at defending against air targets, right? If we catch an air target in close proximity, we can annihilate it. So that's awesome. If we're dealing with, say, light armor and other tanks and infantry, we're going to do very well. But if we're dealing with artillery, maybe not so much. And so these are how you see what you'll do against something. You can see the target type by going to properties and finding the target type. So a normal tank unit is a tank unit. However, a cavalry brigade is a soft unit, just like a garrison. These are the softest units generally in the game, whereas corps and armies here are hard targets. So they are generally what you have to account for when looking at your own values for attacking and defending against hard units. Now, when it comes to movement, this allows me to explain this zone of control thing here. So as we go to move, we'll see this tank can move still, and we'll see these normal movement locations, and some of them say ZOC. Now, I want you to take line of sight into account here. Have you noticed the line of sight? Anywhere that is brightly filled up is somewhere that you can see. And this can be affected by those spotting ranges I showed you earlier. Anywhere that is darkly colored in, you cannot see. It says I can move all the way up to Warsaw. Doesn't mean I can. If there's a unit here, or here, or here, or here, or here, or here, anywhere bordering my destination that or even in the way of it, that I cannot see, then it will trigger kind of an ambush where they will attack me and have the advantage and stop my movement. So don't always trust this as where you can go. There could be some hidden zones of control like this, and you can kind of see the zone of control at work here. You see how we can get up this far? Well, let's look at it from another side too. Look at this zone of control. It's being cast by these units. Armies are especially good at casting zones of control. Generally, the bigger and stronger of a frontline unit, like tanks and armies, the more zones of control they'll cast. So generally, moving in this direction should take maybe 1 action point per movement. It's 2, because I'm running through an enemy zone of control. The more zones of control you stack, the more dramatic this effect can become, flat out preventing me in many instances from reaching different locations. You see, it kind of shows me the area where I could reach if not for these dastardly zones of control getting in my way. As units weaken, their zones of control they cast will become less, and so you could use that to your advantage. There are different kinds of zones of control. There's a full zone of control cast by, for example, an army. A corps casts a weak zone of control, and a garrison casts, well, still a weak one, but essentially no zone of control, like medium bombers. The smaller and weaker and less strength the unit, the less zone of control it will cast. An army at full strength is enough to cast a pretty beefy zone of control all by itself to prohibit enemy movement beyond a certain point. A couple corps would be needed to make up for that, or a gigantic army of garrisons. Planes could never hope to cast a zone of control like that, and at sea, zones of control work a little bit differently, but we'll get to that. Now, these units will be given to you either at the start of the game or on certain events, some of which you can kind of find in the manual and the strategy guide, which you can access through these buttons, helpful buttons over here at the top right. But if you want to purchase any new ones, you'll have to go ahead over here to purchase, select which major country you want to purchase from, and they will have minor countries underneath them that will use their MPP. So with Germany, I could purchase Slovakian units, eventually Hungarian, Bulgarian, Romanian. Italy has Italian, East Africa. Japan will not get allotted if you don't do diplomacy, but it is possible for minors to appear under here. This is probably more important on the allied side of things. Regardless, by hitting purchase, I can look at all the different units I can make here. Some of them are not always available to start. For example, heavy tanks for the Germans don't unlock until the end of 1941. It's a different date for every nation. Japan doesn't get heavy tanks available until January of 1944. Other things that are red indicate that you already have enough of them. There are hard caps, and you could turn these hard caps off when setting up a game. I went over that in my beginner's guide. And you could see some of them are already prepaid for. This is the amount of ordered units already, and every country has some already. Germany's a little simpler to look at. These are the months from top to bottom. It's 2 different months in a row, and from left to right is the chronology of those months. So January will always come before February, and 1940 will always come before 41. So as you see here, we have March, April. We could see 2 things coming in March of 1940, something coming in April of 1940, and then April again, but 1942. And that's how it displays what's already coming. It counts these in what you can have as the hard cap. And you see this build limit here. This is your hard cap. If you turn on soft caps in the menu instead, then you could build beyond these hard caps, but it costs increasingly more to go beyond these hard caps because the game is balanced around you having access to these hard caps, even though some of them could put you in ahistorical locations. If it is lit up in a white sort of way, that means you can afford this turn. Otherwise, you're going to need to save some money over some turns. If it's grayed out, then you simply cannot afford it yet. You can choose how much of your existing research to put on this new unit from the moment of building, paying that up front, but you could always upgrade that unit once it is delivered. Really depends how much you want to do. You can select preset names here as well, or backspace this out and type in something new like the best engineers, for example. There is no total limit on what units you can have other than the build limits you see here. It is possible to go over the build limits either through events such as Japan getting a whole bunch of special forces, for example, or let's say I already know that, for example, we could get some paid for event cavalry during Barbarossa. I could go ahead and make all the cavalry I can make in the build limits, and then when I spawn in the new cavalry, it would actually go over the hard cap. It just means if any of it died, I wouldn't be able to rebuild it because we're already over the cap. There's a handy little button here you could turn on if you want the game to ask you, like, to make sure you actually want to purchase this unit once you hit the purchase button, just in case you're someone that misclicks. You will generally shift nations whenever you click on a relevant unit. Like I could just go over to Japan, immediately start using their units, and as you see, it's shifted over anyway. Discussing the role of HQs is important. This is actually incredibly important, as HQs can change everything. When you have an HQ, as you see, these guys are highlighted in green, it can attach units to it, which can not only bolster their supply, but also their readiness, their morale, and make them far more effective. There are 2 ways to handle this. Set mode, you can have automatic, auto assist, and manual. The more manual you make it, the more you'll be able to simply choose who gets assigned to what, and it'll show you the different types of units you can attach, but there are maximums to how many you can attach. However, I found this feature very finicky. Even speaking to those who have played way more of this game than me, they say they all hate the manual and to just use auto, and I agree with them, though it can lead to some annoyances, some grievances. HQs are also really good at bolstering supply, so let's talk about supply. So if I hit S, or one of these things down here that shows supply as well, hide show supply, I will see the supply of every location. You can also kind of see it on the strength, this little number right here. And if you go click on a location, supply right here as well. Supply, I already sort of discussed its purpose and what it allows you to do in terms of reinforcing and building up readiness and morale. And HQ can actually buff up supply that comes from a location to make it spread better. So for example, let's say there is 10 supply coming from Prague, and then I put an HQ on there. It'll actually buff above 10 and then trickle forward. So let's say it buffs up to 12, then instead of the next hex being 9, it will actually be 11. And instead of the next hex being, say, 8, then it would be 10. And then this would reach different units. I could also simply have HQs closer to the front to try to boost up supply in a more proximal way. I can even put one HQ on a point of supply, heavy supply, and then have it boost supply that goes outwards, and then put another HQ somewhere further down the line to bounce that supply number back up so it can extend even further down a road or into a field or you name it. The effectiveness of how HQs works, it comes down to their rating. And rating is affected by historical factors. Usually these are historical generals. And it's also affected by your command and control. Every level of command and control will raise the level of your HQs by 1, this effectiveness rating, and also extend the range that they can operate at, as well as the amount of units that they can attach. You can also sack a commander and replace it with a higher rated 1. This does cost a lot of money. See, insufficient funds right now, but sometimes the rewards can be totally worth it if you don't plan on just giving that guy soon, like his own HQ, for example, like von Manstein. He's incredibly useful to either purchase an HQ for or replace somebody else with him because he's just that good. His rating is that high and it only gets higher. If you ever want to move units quickly, you click to just access the normal movement. If you double click, for example, and there's a button here for this instead, like Force March, you could go even further, but you won't be able to attack and it will get rid of readiness and morale. Upgrading with mobility specifically is also a very useful thing, but it is very expensive. As you see, it'll be all of my MPP's turn to give this mobility. Planes, not every unit, this is an example, gets access to like a Force March, for example. If I click double or triple, it's just showing me the intercept and escort ranges. This is where we lead to operational movement. On a land unit, operating comes down to being on a hex that has a railroad. To spot a railroad, you're gonna have to just visually spot these teeny tiny graphics looking for a railroad. Not a road, a railroad. Hit operate, spend whatever MPPs it asks, you hit yes, and then you select any location that has enough supply, and then you can make that unit appear there. For example, up by Hamburg. There you go, we've teleported, quote unquote, by operating there for money, and this has allowed us to arrive there much faster than we would have with normal means. However, it's also consumed our turn, and no attacks or reinforcement can follow. The same thing can be done with air units, with the exception of they don't need access to a railroad, they just need supply, and then I could take them and send them somewhere else. Like if Germany owned Libya, they could go from right up here to Libya, somewhere where there's enough supply, in an instant. With default rules, AI opponents will actually be given free units as well that you'll have to deal with, but I've shown in my previous guide how to turn a lot of that off. Otherwise, that's most of the basics of how just this stuff works. However, we have to look at the Navy side of things. It gets quite different, the Navy side of things. There are zones of control, but they don't quite work the same. If there's an enemy ship in my way, for example, I guess I can demonstrate with this. If there's an enemy ship in my way, let's pretend this is an enemy ship, I can go ahead and just sail right through it. I do risk taking damage by doing that, however, and it does get additionally costly, and this goes across like all different unit types. Every unit, every naval unit does have the ability to be in a raider mode. If they're on a raider mode, then they can actually raid convoy lines not belonging to their own side. Blue is Axis, red is allies, and white means inactive. Now, submarines here can do this kind of raiding a lot more effectively than, say, a surface raider, and they can do it in a much different... Submarines can be a whole topic in them goddamn selves, man. Submarines are special because by default, the enemy doesn't know where a submarine is. They're hard to spot. Now, if I were to go along to this route and raid it, the enemy would get an indicator, hey, there's something here raiding your stuff. It goes for surface raiders as well. However, it gives away the location of a submarine, which can be problematic. You might want to keep your subs on the move as a result. However, if you're here, I can't change the mode now that I've moved, but if you're out somewhere like this, right, and you set to silent so that you're not raiding, or in the case of a surface raider, you know, you just don't have raider mode on, then you won't raid nearby things. A silent sub cannot move as far as a sub that is on hunt mode. However, it is much better for getting around and keeping yourself hidden, because then there will just be no indication to where you are at all. Surface raiders won't really have the same problems to deal with. If an enemy runs into a ship, it will trigger a combat, but submarines are especially good as working as traps. If an enemy runs in, then the sub is going to lay a surprise attack on the enemy most of the time. If a sub runs into an enemy, it can do the same thing, but it's less likely to be beneficial and less likely to happen at all because that wouldn't be as good. Subs are great defenders, not attackers. They're great things to place in the way of things where you think the enemy's gonna go, not to actually use offensively, with the exception of raiding these convoy lines. Compared to the wondrous world of zones of control on and above land, naval combat is a lot different, where you'll either have to skirmish ships over wide areas or make big circular fleets to move around in. The strategy you take in this game is really yours. The mechanics are pretty open to support a bunch of different kinds of strategies under the rules that I have been teaching you. Seeing that this is a military game and the whole game kind of revolves around war, I should also mention some other basics you'll want to take all these mechanics into, such as up here are morale bars, national morale bars. If they hit 0, that nation will surrender and disappear. The bar will technically fill back up, but the nation will surrender nonetheless. If you want a better view of everything, you can zoom out twice here and then get access to the war map, which you can also see by going to the war map and going to the strategy map for a smaller version of the same thing. These flickering lights mean units you have not actually done all their movements with yet. You can access those linearly by doing page up, page down, and it just kind of cycles through everything based on where you have selected to as you spam through, in case you want to really make sure that you got everything. Tooltips are pretty important for certain things like this right here. So if you're not seeing these, this is very relevant to waging war. Make sure that this little button right here is checked. You got a lot of filters and stuff down here that you might want to activate or not activate, such as the partisan filter. So this is also very important for war. So this game has partisans. If you see partisans, it's because that side, that nation's in the war, and its partisans will only affect the opposite side. Once a nation is on one side of the war, it will stay there. It will not swap without some kind of event. And there's two different kinds of partisan hexes. This one right here that looks just like a normal unit. You find this by hitting P, for example. And this one that has a big no symbol going through it. The standard one means if you don't leave, let's say I took over France. If I don't leave a unit within 1 hex, a land unit, for example, within 1 hex of this spot, then a French partisan unit can raise up on this spot, you know, taking the city and joining the fight against me. Enemy doesn't have to pay anything for it. An enemy won't really lose anything for it if I were to kill the partisan. Now, the one that has the no symbol means it'll still have partisan activity, but it's not going to spawn a unit if I leave the area undefended. Instead of that, it is going to cause damage. So for example, it could cause supply damage to Paris, which can lower the amount of MPPs Paris is generating. The French don't have to worry about this because this is an allied nation. I would have to worry about this. China is one such area that has a lot of partisans. There's also the Soviets, but we can't see that yet because the Soviets are not in the war yet. You won't actually see any of the partisan points until you declare war. With the most historical playthrough possible, it's really just the Axis that's going to be dealing with partisans of all the nations it takes over. But a more aggressive allies or a less historical Axis might have nations that have partisan resistances themselves. Like if an Axis manages to diplomatically get Yugoslavia to join it, then when the Allies show up, they wouldn't be liberating Yugoslavia, they'd be conquering it. And as they conquer it, they would then have to deal with partisan points just like this by leaving, for example, any land unit within 1 hex. So in that kind of grid around or on top of, either one works. This rule allows you to potentially take care of 2 garrisons at once. For example, if you put something here on Nanchang, we'll actually take care of 3 partisan points at once. None of these are points that would spawn partisans, only cause MPP damage and supply damage to the surroundings, but still, 1 garrison here takes care of 3, or 1 garrison here takes care of 2. This game is turn-based, and it's I go, you go, so you'll be doing all of your actions on your turn that you can. When you hit end turn, it will pass it off to the AI or the other player. That person or AI will do its own turns, and then it will pass it back to you. From you to the other player is a 2-week period of time. From the other player to you is another 2-week period of time. So every time you hit end turn, it'll be another month, or, well, 4 weeks. Anyway, until you get your turn back. If you ever want to see statistics about what's going on, open up the reports. This right here is just information on all the units that exist right now. This is all of the, these is like semi-relevant things to keep track of: cities, ports, oil, and mines. This doesn't matter as much as, say, MPPs does, but you have access to graphs where you could specify what you want to see for every nation. It's very not telling at the beginning. These graphs are very important for checking your war progress in the game. You can even check all the losses of each nation, and the detailed losses can be pulled up as well. Finally, there's just a couple special unit types I want to cover real quick. One is the paratroopers. If you have paratroopers, these work a little bit differently. They can't really get around as easily because, well, they use planes, but this gives them different opportunities. So a paratrooper would come out kind of looking like a core. However, if I would right-click it, it would have a mode just like ships do. You could set a mode, and you could set it to prepare. It would take 1 turn to prepare, and then you could move it a much further distance that would be specified in the properties, and that would essentially show you the range that it could fly and then land to, you know, with a paratrooper paradrop. When it lands, it can move a little bit or do 1 attack before being done. Make sure it gets access to supply wherever you send it though, because otherwise it's going to be stranded, run out of supply, and start dying. So these are tricky units to use well, and the game doesn't afford you very many of them, no matter what side you're playing as. The other one's going to be Special Forces, which works with the naval landing mechanics of the game. So let's touch on those now. I've already shown you the whole right-click to operate units thing. This kind of has an effect with the naval units as well. I'll show you this with Japan. So with Japan, we have, say, the Special Forces here. If I right-click any land unit that is 1 hex next to a port, doesn't have to be where the port is facing, just next to a port, bordering it, I can transport that unit. This is like Operation, but by sea. However, it spawns a literal transport that can go around and then land somewhere. If I want to get something out to sea, I have to pay money, 25 MPPs in the case of this core, and then be able to move it around and then send it wherever I want to go. For example, I can move up here, Showing you an example of an ambush, by the way. Sail this over here. And if this had enough supply, which it doesn't right now, I would be able to land. It's one thing to keep in mind about the limitations of transports. Then there's amphibious transports right here. These are like transports. They move very slowly, but they get a attack included with the much higher price that you pay to put them out to sea. Very useful for example, a D-Day. Getting a bunch of amphibious transports, moving forward with air and naval support, landing, using their attacks to clear the beaches, and there you go. They only get that one attack though, so you have to use it very, very wisely. And then there's the long-range amphibious transports, which are much rarer. All these are influenced by, say, your amphibious warfare tech, and also by what nation it is. America and Japan kind of just get the most of these by default. Long range can move pretty much just as far as a normal transport. They're not as limited as an amphibious transport. They still get that one attack. And one distinction between these two is that amphibious transports, once you load them up, they will be losing supply every single turn until they do something, like land. Long-range amphibious transports can use ports to keep themselves in supply and stay at sea much, much longer, but they cost much, much more. 71 for this unit instead of, say, 57. If I look over here, we take amphibious transport. This is what amphibious transport looks like. It won't be able to move very much once you put it out to sea, but it'll have a movement of, as you see, 5 action points, so 5 hexes. Whereas an amphibious transport, which it popped out over here due to spacing, but will be able to move 16, kind of like a normal transport, a normal ship even. Now, special forces like this are very special in that they can get on a amphibious transport like this one right here from anywhere where they have supply. Even knocked behind like a mountain, if they're stuck here, they're being pushed back, they could still get on an amphibious transport and get away. They're like your Marines. Additionally, just like how paratroopers can land somewhere, if they don't get supply, they'll be out of supply next turn, so you have to be careful with that. If you amphibious land any unit, even with a long-range transport, into a location that doesn't have supply, the next turn they'll be out of supply, they're going to start dying. Special forces, no matter how you land them, are going to land and then immediately they'll have 10 supply, right? It'll go down by 1 every single turn. It's not immediately going to go down to 0. It's going to degrade turn by turn because they're the ones that are really meant the most for these landings. They're not as strong as an army. They can be around the ballpark of a corps, for example, but more expensive because they have this increased capability to them for naval landings that makes them the best unit for these sorts of naval landings and the most versatile given their ability to just get on a long-range transport, even lacking having a port next to them. Another sort of special quirk I want to mention is carriers, because they're a mixture of naval and aerial units. They're like a nerfed version of both that could be better than having either, depending on how you look at it and what you use them for. But there's some modes I want to go over quick to help you understand them. So remember to look at the properties so you understand what they're capable of. The properties for them will apply to a mixture of the boat and the planes. Attack values will apply to the planes. Defense is applying generally to the boat. Since it is a combination unit, it has a strength for the ship and a strength for the planes. And it gives some aerial information as well as having all these ship-based features, for example. But it is capable of going pretty fast. It has its different modes, and I want to show you this real quick. So 2 main different modes you want to focus on is fighters and bombers. This means you are setting either 100% of the planes on this carrier to fighters or 100% of the planes on this carrier to bombers. Mix means you're splitting it half and half. I would suggest just never using mix. Mix means you'll be ready for anything. However, it also means you'll only be ready for anything at half strength. If you're not expecting to bomb something, have it on fighters, right? If you're expecting to bomb something, have it on bombers. And that's really the main thing. If you do have it on fighters, you have a cap mode. You could either automatically have it shift between intercept, escort. Generally, you'll move carriers and groups together, so some can be dedicated to bombers and a couple could be dedicated to fighters, whatever you need for max efficiency to make every mission go as swell as possible. That would be the ideal way to use them. They need a lot of protection because they are a little more vulnerable than other kinds of ships are. You know, you'll want destroyers for them, especially because, well, if a battleship runs up to a destroyer, that's oof. If a submarine tries to get up on your carrier, then the defensive value of 5 to subs means that sudden ambush attack that will happen, potentially, will go a lot better on the destroyer. There's also some coastal patrol ships, but generally destroyers are better as long-range escorts because they can actually keep up with these sorts of fleet ships. There's also escort carriers, which are a little bit different. Their bombers are actually amphibious bombers, which is a specific unit type that you can buy yourself. You see all these different bombers here. Maritime bombers, these are the ones that I'm referring to. They are essentially maritime bombers. Escort carriers are your ASW, separate to destroyers, separate to coastal patrol ships. Normal fleet carriers are not really going to be too amazing at wiping out anything other than ships. Really, mostly? You know, yeah, ships. Not even really land targets. They're kind of two coins of an amphibious bomber. This one, the fleet carriers have the bombers that are good at the surface bombing, whereas the escort carrier has the part of the amphibious bomber that's good at ASW. But they can still handle surface ships as well. Carriers are very interesting, and how you use them can literally just decide how your game goes, because really the most important nations that have the most important things for the long term of how a game goes are the ones that have carriers. It feels like I could just go on and on and on about this forever. I've actually been recording this for 2 hours. This is a war game, and there's a lot, even if this game is simple. So if you want me to go more in depth on any of the topics we touched upon, or cover any topics that I haven't touched upon yet, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. I'll be filling up that playlist in the description to the best of my ability on how you can play this game, and the rules kind of carry over to other recent Strategic Command games as well, so hopefully they can help you in that regard as well. For now, thank you guys very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on another one.